When Katie emailed me to ask what was the title of the session today, I almost emailed her back to say perhaps we should call it Third Time Lucky or something to that effect. This is also on the back, of course, of Stephen, the gracious, gentle person that he is, threatening me on Friday not to get ill. I am glad to be with you finally to, as Stephen has already intimated, tease out some ideas, to explore some things with you, or so that we can explore some things together as we journey reflecting on transformative learning. As Stephen has also intimated, the umbrella under which all of this sits is a piece of research that I'm doing called Preaching as Transformative Learning. And so that's kind of the big picture, the goal, the ultimate destination, if you like, towards which we're heading. But there are a few assumptions that are being made in this paper I'm presenting today. The first of which has to do with exegetical understandings of Ephesians 4 and verse 11. And in this respect, I side with John Stott, who, while acknowledging 5 gifts are listed, suggested that perhaps pastor and teacher are 2 names of the same ministry. He further highlights that pastors, that is, tending of the flock, is done by means of feeding it, that is, teaching. Thus, for him, all pastors are teachers, but not all teachers are called to be pastors. The second assumption that will be made is that, far from being passé, preaching is still a legitimate God-ordained format of communicating God's word to God's people. And that the gathered people of God is not an idea whose time has passed. As a musician, singer, worship leader with Baptist-Costal leanings, it may surprise you to note that I still think, for instance, that the sermon, however we define it, is the crucial element within the worship service. Social attitudes, changes in expectations, and educational insights raise questions about how we preach, not whether or not we do. This argument, while assumed here, will need to be and will be developed and defended elsewhere, just not today. The pastor preacher as teacher, then, is, I think, a natural trajectory from the foregoing assumptions. New Testament writings on the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, for instance, gives us an example of Jesus as the teacher. The New Testament epistles take this concept further, and Timothy and Titus are admonished, if you explain these things to the brothers and sisters, Timothy, you will be a worthy servant, or minister, as the NIV puts it, of Jesus Christ, who is nourished by faith. One is nourished by faith and the good teaching you have followed. 1 Timothy 4, verse 6 and following. In verse 11, it talks about commanding and teaching these things, or teaching these things and insist that everyone learn them. And then to Titus, as for you, Titus, promote the kind of living that reflects wholesome teaching. Teach what is appropriate and sound doctrine. So as we see in the New Testament, just from those glimpses, there is that encouragement towards passing on what we know, towards teaching, to be ministers of God's word who teach. I should perhaps say to you that in a moment you will hear many names with which some of you will be unfamiliar, because a lot of these folks are from the educational spectrum or from the adult education world. And so some of the names that many of the names that will be referred to are from that field. Parker Palmer, for instance, is one who, in his work, To Know as We Are Known, Education as a Spiritual Journey, raised questions, which are also raised elsewhere, about the perceived way of the dominant teacher-pastor figure representing the repository of all knowledge. These challenges concerned not just our pedagogy, that is our approaches to teaching and learning, but our ontology, the nature of what is known, and its epistemology, how we know this reality. This, he further suggests, raises questions about the application of acquired knowledge, that is, the ethical implications, or as I like to put it, as everybody knows, so what? How then do we live? What do we do with all of this that we have learned or gained or appropriated? There may be some credence to the idea that the dominant way of knowing, post-Reformation and Enlightenment and throughout modernity, for instance, was seen as cognitive. That is, something about the rational mind, understanding and churning ideas over with our heads. But as we examine and we reflect together as Christian believers, as we must do, we see the claim that Jesus of Nazareth makes, for instance, to be the truth. And I know there are discussions and arguments about what is truth, and Pilate asked it way back when, and how can truth be known? Is there such a thing as objective truth? And so on. And someone's ringing in with the truth on the mobile phone. But Jesus' claims challenge, it seems to me, the very concept of ultimate reality being merely objective, but rather that it centers in and on a person, Jesus himself. But you would expect me to say that as a theologian and a Christian. But what it seems to me to suggest is that it makes reality, ultimate reality, if you like, personal. That which is to be found in a personal God. So the ontological question becomes an epistemological one. How can we know this God? And in a moment I will make an altar call for those of you who want to come forward and know him. There is, of course, more that can and should be said about the Trinitarian understanding of God as being in communion. See, for example, John Zizoulis, a theologian and a writer. But suffice it to say that the intimations of a God in communion, creating human beings in God's image, at the very least, suggest ideas of human beings also as beings in communion. Why am I mentioning this? Well, the implication of this communal view of our being, this ontological refocusing, if you like, to being in communion, is that we are the body of Christ. Together, we are the body of Christ, the people of God, the gathered people, the ecclesia, if you like. And this hints at community approach to being and becoming. This may, in turn, suggest a shift towards Malcolm Knowles, the educational writer, his ideas of andragogy, where he talks about us facilitating knowledge and learning, or Ferrer's problem-solving approach to learning and adult education. It might interest you to know that although I have so far emphasize this approach to learning from the cognitive, the idea of thinking, and we will come back to that in a moment, and the rational ways of knowing, that since the advent, for instance, or the emergence, one might say, of the Pentecostal movement, circa 1905, the charismatic movements, circa the 1960s and other places, there seems to this seems to have brought about a refocusing on what we call the affective rather than the cognitive aspects of learning. Affective has to do with the emotions, which we will say more about in a moment. Learning that includes emotions, not just mental cognition. Compare, for instance, in recent times, writings from Daniel Goleman. Some of you probably never heard of him, but you have heard of emotional intelligence, for instance. So again, that shift towards not just the cognitive, but the affective. My aim here today is to begin to sketch the landscape of transformative learning, to dangle the idea that this particular approach to adult education links all these concepts that I've just mentioned together and may be a viable approach to developing, strengthening, and perhaps even redeeming the idea of preaching in the 21st and 22nd centuries. Redeeming it as a means or a vehicle for adult education, for adult learning, for growth and change. There seems to be a general consensus that theories of learning, since they've identified and defined them or discovered them and given them these names, ideas of Christian spirituality, similar things, and adult education have been seen to coexist as valid avenues for the propagation of ideas in the context, for instance, of Christian gathering, in the context of the church, in the context of a college or university setting, for passing on the word of God. Yet, as Jonathan Stewart in an article in the Jate Journal suggests, very rarely are they linked within the specific context of Christian worship or a Christian worship service. So to clarify, my proposal then is that transformative learning, which I will define and unpack for you in the next however long we speak for, is that transformative learning is a way of doing this, of ensuring these links are explicit within the context of the gathered church. So, by now you may well be asking, what is this animal called transformative learning? Perhaps the first thing to highlight about transformative learning, excuse me, is that it is a theory of adult education that is seen as a process of deliberate engagement with one's previously unexamined assumptions, values, and beliefs as lenses through which one's experiences are viewed. As Merriam highlights in Transformative Learning, one's values, beliefs, and assumptions become the lens through which personal experience is mediated and made sense of. Jack Mesereau, Professor Jack Mesereau of the Teachers College of Columbia University, first proposed the theory of transformative learning in 1975 in a landmark qualitative research study of adult women who returned to community college to continue their education after a long absence. As developed by Mesereau, transformative learning theory is a comprehensive theory of adult learning, or at least he thinks it is a comprehensive theory of adult learning. It's a theory about how we understand, interpret the varied experiences which make up our lives and the worlds in which we live. Transformative learning theory is focused on how persons make meaning from their experiences. A defining condition of being human, says Mesereau, is that we have to understand the meaning of our experiences. As human beings, we are constantly making meaning out of what happens to us and around us. We seek to make sense of the world and how it works, and to that end we have learned over time, for instance, to construct a certain way of seeing and understanding the world. We all have particular ways in which we interpret what occurs, what happens to us, what happens around us. And according to Mesereau, our ways of making meaning and seeing the world are grounded in, for the most part, unexamined values, beliefs, and assumptions. These values, beliefs, and assumptions are absorbed, often uncritically, from our families, communities, and cultures. Thus, we live with a set of expectations about how the world works and what it means. These expectations act as a lens through which the world and how we live and move and have our being is viewed. But what happens when something occurs that doesn't quite fit into these expectations, or particular expectations of the world or how the world works? What happens when the unexpected occurs and our past experiences and all our values, beliefs, assumptions no longer help us in making meaning? What happens when our world is turned upside down and inside out and we are disoriented? Students entering Spurgeons College, for instance, are often unprepared for what they experience. Encounters with living human documents with deaths and trauma and codes, the foreign language of theological discourse, various encounters with peers in the groups and with tutors and supervisors are challenging. Students are off balance and reeling emotionally and spiritually. As Mesereau and others highlight, we basically have two main options when we experience the unexpected. The first option is to simply reject the unexpected through denial, repression, or some other coping mechanism, and thus hold fast to our familiar values, beliefs, assumptions, or whatever. The second option is to open ourselves up to begin the process of critically questioning, critically reflecting upon our unexamined expectations. You might want to compare, for instance, those of you who are aware of the work of Grentz and Olson in their book, Let's Do Theology, the continuum that they have on lay theologian, folk theologian, lay theologian, ministerial theologian, professional theologian, academic theologian. He basically says, as Christians, we're all theologians. It's just about what kind of theologian you are, whether you are critically examining your position or not. Patricia Cranton, another educationalist, writes this. She says, when people critically examine their habitual expectations, revise them, and act on the revised point of view, transformative learning occurs. At its core, transformative learning theory is actually elegantly simple. It's about change. In broad terms, transformative learning is a process in which persons question, examine, validate, and reconstruct their perspective on the world and the way it works. The theory seeks to understand the process by which adults' meaning perspective, or your frame of reference, is changed as a result of encountering different perspectives, different experiences. How does your meaning perspective change? How does your frame of reference change? Does it change? Is it impacted? Reflecting critically on these different perspectives and reassessing one's beliefs, one's values, one's feelings is vital in the process of transformation, I suggest to you. This change in a person's frame of reference represents learning. One of the interesting things that we often talk about is the difference between teaching and learning. You know, we can be carrying on forever thinking that we are teaching, but are our students learning? Transformative learning is about turning that the other way around and empowering the student, as it were, to engage in the learning process so that learning occurs. Transformative learning theory then suggests that when a person changes his or her frame of reference, that frame of reference typically becomes more inclusive, discriminating, open, reflective, and emotionally able to change. You're more likely to listen to others, to engage with others, to examine your own point of view. As transformative learning theory has developed over the last few years, It has generated much conversation within the disciplines, for instance, of adult education in particular, but also within some elements of the Christian education sector. Several different perspectives of the theory have emerged, and the literature is growing every day. I made the mistake, I mean, it's a right thing to do, but I did make the mistake of, for instance, getting a Google alert to alert me when anything on transformative learning comes up. I'm telling you, I am really struggling to try and keep up with not just checking the emails that keep coming through, but even reading the articles or the 5 sentences on transformative learning that are coming up. But it is a theory that is continuing to grow, and more people are engaging with it, and more Christian educators and folks involved in ministerial formation are now becoming interested in this subject. And I'm hoping that they hold off their interest for just a little longer until I've finished writing my research paper. Then they can consult it so that I can present this as, original ideas rather than, so don't send anybody else all of these things. That might have just suggested that you don't upload this one until after finish. Anyway, I digress. We could be here forever. These perspectives on transformative learning encompass a wide range of scholarship and practice, and further suggest that the theory is dynamic and unfolding, and is, as Mesereau and his associates suggest, a work in progress. Today, I merely am giving, as I've already said, a brief overview of the theory, and will now focus primarily on 2 aspects of it. So the rational and cognitive, and the affective, or rational or cognitive. Sometimes it's called rational, sometimes it's called cognitive. And then the other is the affective dimensions within the transformative learning process. And you will see on the handouts that I've given you, I've jotted down some of the key points on both of those areas. As we begin to focus on the affective side later on, you will begin to see, I hope, why I think that, or why I'm suggesting that preaching fits within this framework, points us towards preaching as transformative learning. So the rational cognitive dimension then of transformative learning. Mesereau's conceptualization of transformative learning begins with his emphasis on perspective, or the way a person sees and makes sense of the world. A perspective is essentially a worldview, a lens through which experience is interpreted in order to make sense of and understand the world the person inhabits. Using Habermas's concept of emancipatory learning, and it is Habermas because he's American and not Habermas, as is the other pronunciations. He is Habermas. Using Habermas's concept of emancipatory learning, where learning is more than technical and practical, Mesereau defines meaning perspective as the structure of psychocultural assumptions within which new experience is assimilated and transformed by one's past experience. I'll say that again. Mesereau defines meaning perspective, your frame of reference if you like, as the structure of psychocultural assumptions within which new experience is assimilated and transformed by one's past experience. A perspective transformation is a process of becoming critically aware of how and why the structure of sociocultural assumptions has come to constrain the way we see ourselves and our relationships, reconstituting this structure to permit a more inclusive and discriminating integration of experience, and acting upon these new understandings. I want you to notice how many times throughout our presentation here, you will hear the phrases critically reflecting on, and then followed by, and acting upon. Because one of the key things about the whole idea of transformative learning theory is the engagement with critical reflection, but also then doing something about it, feeding that into who you are and your frame of reference, your outlook, your point of view, and then acting it out. I recently preached a sermon. Now, this is dangerous. I'm digressing from my notes, so we could be here all day. I recently preached a sermon using the little phrase, the exclamation, the aha. I'm talking about our aha moments. And a guy called Kyle somebody, or I can't remember his name now, has nicked my ideas. I didn't communicate with him, so I don't know how he got it. But he has actually written a book called Aha, seizing your aha moments. And it's about that. The first A is the awakening, and the H is about honesty, being honest with yourself. And then the third A, aha, is about action. And that, the awakening, the honest reflection, and then the action. And in a sense, transformative learning, and you can, after I've summarized it this way, you can stop listening now, is in essence this aha moment that we're talking about, that awakening, the critical reflection of the honesty, and then the action. In other words, says Mesereau, a meaning perspective is represented by a person's predisposition to see life and experience it a certain way. For example, a person may have certain expectations about the way a liberal Christian is supposed to think and act, or how, for instance, a worship service ought to be conducted, or how a research paper ought to be presented, for instance. And so, therefore, we have learnt behaviors in our time together. These are expectations. They are learnt, we imbibe them, we absorb them. They're socially, culturally, personally constructed over time. Hence, having come to several research seminars in the past, I am now reading a paper. Some of you will get it. I remember a previous seminar that Hetty Lallemand did here, where she decided that she wasn't going to do that because, the research seminar should be about engaging and educating. And she did some stuff on Jeremiah, and she got us into groups discussing. And I could see the questions and the faces going, what? I'm supposed to be sitting there at a research seminar where you present a paper to me. What do you mean I have to do work? And do you remember, Hetty? She did something on Jeremiah, and she had us talking, and she did it a totally different way. And I thought, yeah, good, refreshing. Yet I am constrained by my socially, culturally, and personally learned expectations. And so I am reading my research seminar paper. But as is well known, life never stays the same. Change happens. Some of the change is due to the normal everyday development and growth of the person. Other changes occur through cataclysmic and disorienting events. Mesereau suggests that when events and experiences do not fit into the person's already constructed and comfortable meaning perspectives, a sense of dissonance results. The world does not make sense. Events and experiences do not fit in the usual categories or frames of reference. In other words, out of the norm experiences cannot be resolved within the usual perspective. Something else is needed. Here then is the opportunity for questioning, reassessment, and change, perhaps, in perspective. Assumptions may be challenged. Questions may be raised. The old ways of seeing the world no longer seem to work. The new event does not fit in with the old meaning perspective. Transformation awaits. When a meaning perspective, says Mesereau, no longer comfortably deal with the anomalies in a new situation, a transformation can occur. Mesereau's understanding of the transformative learning process came to include concepts like frame of reference, habits of mind, and points of view. And he sometimes uses some of these concepts as lenses through which to understand transformative learning. So for him, a frame of reference includes cognitive, affective, and conative, that is, attempted action, which may or may not include actual action itself. Dimensions, and it consists of two parts: habits of mind and points of view. Incidentally, although he acknowledges that it should include the affective, he doesn't deal with the affective, the emotions, at all in his writings. Well, he never did until recently. Habits of mind provide ways of seeing the world and are grounded in life history, experiences, culture, and personality. In addition to habits of mind, a frame of reference also includes points of view, which are sets of immediate specific beliefs, feelings, attitudes, and value judgments. A point of view is essentially the rules a person uses, often unconsciously, to interpret experiences. I love this clip from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And apologies for those of you who are fans. I have no idea who the persons are in this particular bit, but one person is having this conversation with the other person. So say, for instance, I'm having this conversation with Peter, and Peter is trying to understand what I'm saying, and he just doesn't get it. And somebody like now, and somebody comes along and presents this long tubular gold thing that they call a point of view gun. How I wish we really had that in real life. And so what would happen is that Peter would hold a point of view gun and point it at me. And I would continue to express and explain what I'm talking about. And somehow by holding this gun, he then sees things from my point of view. And then when he's finished, he passes the gun over to me. I point it to him. He then has his say. And now I understand things from his point of view. I'm telling you, I wish somebody really would invent something like that. This point of view gun. This unconscious way we have of interpreting things, and we think everybody else sees it as we do. Mezirow is cognizant of how resistant to change meaning perspectives can be. Views of the world do not transform easily. The old ways of seeing the world can be defended, as Stevenson Bond notes. In practice, challenges to deeply held convictions are generally met with bitter resistance. You're comfortable. You don't want to be challenged. You don't want to be discombobulated. For Mezirow, the role of critical thinking is the most crucial element in the transformation process. Critical thinking for him drives the transformation of a person's frame of reference. For Mezirow, this means becoming aware of how we are caught up, he says, often without knowing it, in our own histories, psychological assumptions, and cultural presuppositions. While emphasizing the importance of critical thinking, Mezirow also notes that frames of reference do not just consist of thoughts. Without going into detail, he suggests that meaning perspectives and frames of references also have dimensions of feelings and will. He does acknowledge that there is a place for feelings and emotions within the process of transformation, but he places more emphasis on critical thinking and its companions, reason and rationality. So, as I've already intimated, he acknowledges the emotion, but he doesn't go there. He thinks more emphasis should be placed on our critical thinking or reason or rationality. This is one of the key areas of Mezirow's work that has come under sharp criticism, and is taken up, for instance, in Patricia Cranton's work. And Cranton is another of my dialogue partners in this journey and venture. From my perspective, in focusing on preaching, which I will do down the road, the affective has to be included. If you're talking about preaching and preaching the word of God and transforming human beings' lives, the affective has to be included. Nevertheless, learning through transforming one's frame of reference is more than simply acquiring new information and new skills. And in this way, it's different from what others are calling kind of instrumental learning, where you just learn something by rote or something's just passed on to you and you take it and you run with it. It requires a critical awareness of and reflection on one's life histories and the many cultural and psychological assumptions that shapes one's world. For those of you who, for instance, would have gone through Joshua's study skills sessions, would know that he goes on and on and on about critical reflection and critical thinking in particular, and critical reading. And so he probably would side with Meserow on this issue anyway, that critical awareness and critical reflection on one's way of being is of paramount importance. Meserow further suggests that the transformation of a frame of reference includes certain phases and processes. And based on Meserow's original 1975 study, Cranton describes the 10 phases and processes, which I have listed for you on the table below. Now, I will just touch on them very briefly and tell you this one thing that you need to know about Meserow's processes. He believes that all of these 10 phases are actually steps that one has to go through for transformation to happen. So he starts with experiencing a disorienting dilemma. And I really, really, really love that phrase, because it explains so much about what we experience, and certainly what students experience when they first arrive here at Spurgeons. But he says, for transformation to happen, experiencing a disorienting dilemma, undergoing self-examination, feelings of, he includes and adds to that feelings of guilt and shame, constructing a critical assessment of internalized assumptions, and by conducting a critical assessment of these assumptions, there is that feeling of alienation from traditional social expectations, recognition of connection between one's discontent and transformation. In other words, what he's saying, when you start feeling uncomfortable or discontent with something, it's a sign that something is shifting and changing, or could be shifting and changing. He would say embrace that. Explore options for new roles, new relationships, new actions, new ways of being and acting. Then planning a course of action, acquiring knowledge and skills for implementing a new course of action, provisionally trying out new roles and assessing them, building competence and self-confidence in new roles and relationships, and then finally reintegration into one's life and society with a new perspective. Meserow suggests that the presence of a disorienting dilemma, the first of the 10 phases, most often serves as a catalyst for perspective transformation. Such a dilemma might be a life-changing event, such as a death of a spouse, an unexpected divorce, the sudden loss of a job, or the diagnosis of a life-threatening illness, or returning to study after many years and to discover that the things you believed, the things you held firmly, may have been built on erroneous foundations, or that the King James Bible is not a reliable translation, for instance. Meserow says, the traumatic severity of the disorienting dilemma is clearly a factor in establishing the probability of a transformation. The disorienting experience propels the person to begin the process of examining, questioning, and reflecting on his or her assumptions, values, beliefs, and understanding of the world. Transformative learning can also occur more gradually over time, and there may be a slower incremental change that occurs in a person's point of view, which can eventually lead to a change in a habit of mind. Now, while I agree with Meserow's view that a disorienting dilemma can propel us towards a change and propel us towards a transformation, I don't think that it always necessarily does. I mean, he already says, and I said this earlier, that there are two options. Well, more or less two options. You can choose to run away and stick with what you know and stay where you are, and this disorienting dilemma can become too uncomfortable, and you don't want to go down that route. I know that there are experiences that many students over the years, I experienced it myself when I was a student here, go through when this disorienting dilemma happens, especially when you discover from certain church background that the King James Bible really isn't, the very words of God, the ipsissima verba, when you are being told that you might want to try another translation. And several other things begin to happen, and several questions are being raised about it, and it feels like your very faith and foundation is being challenged. And then you go back to church on Sunday and you try to integrate some of what you are learning that you're still not sure about. You're still disoriented yourself, and you're trying to engage in a context that you knew so well, and suddenly find it doesn't fit anymore. And you go, ah! Theological expression. And so, yes, the disorienting dilemma, yeah, but until and unless there is that deliberate step towards a willingness to change, that embracing of the self-critical examination, and then moving forward, change, transformation won't necessarily happen. And this is where I think also, leaving the paper now, also the idea of the affective needs to be taken more into consideration. Because that stirs up a whole host of emotions and feelings, and I like the word discombobulates, one, and discomforts one. And what do you do with those emotions? How do you engage with them if they are not a part of the learning process, if they're not included in this learning process of transformative learning? For Mezirow, as I already said, it's driven by rational discourse and critical thinking. And he lists conditions within which this rational discourse could and should happen, and I've listed them there for you in terms of information, being free from coercion and distorting self-perception. Well, how can you be free from distorting self-perception if you don't take into account the affective, the emotions, how that affects that? How can you be able to weigh the evidence and assess arguments objectively, be open to alternative perspectives, until and unless you have embraced certain ways of knowing and doing? So in summary then, several key elements frame the rational dimension of transformative learning. A central focus on a person's frame of reference, the how and why that frame of reference might be changed through questioning assumptions and presuppositions, through critical reflection and rational discourse. 10-phase process leading from a disorienting dilemma to reintegration of a new frame of reference, and finally, an understanding that transformation may occur suddenly or over time. Now, very briefly then, I will look at the affective dimension of transformative learning. I say very briefly because this kind of just whets the appetite, and it is this bit that I think I will need to engage with and develop even further, because I think, and not that I'm dismissing the cognitive side or the rational side, don't mishear me on that. I think it's very important and crucial, but the affective side speaks to, I think, our ministry as preachers and deliverers of God's word, or pizza delivery people, as I like to call us sometimes. So we're delivering God's word. So the affective dimensions then. While Mezirow's conceptualization of transformative learning emphasizes rational thought and discourse, there is more to the learning process than just the cognitive. One of the primary critiques of Mezirow, as I mentioned earlier, is that there is an over-reliance on rationality. This criticism of Mezirow's over-reliance on rationality has led to several studies that have demonstrated the importance of feelings, of other ways of knowing in transformative learning. These studies refer to their significance in ways such as intuition by Brooks, affective learning by Clark and Scott, and Svenun. I should have asked Hetty how to pronounce this. I think it's Venungard or Svenungard. He talks about the guiding force of feeling, or Hunter and Taylor, who talk about whole person learning. Svenungard, spelled Svenunggaard.
Say that again.
Svenunggaard.
It's not the Dutch name.
I think so. Well, him. It's a him. He said, in a study exploring the role of affective learning in transformation, he found that participants could not act on cognitive learning until they had engaged in learning how to identify, explore, validate, and express the affective. So when he did a study, he said they couldn't engage in the cognitive learning until they were able to identify what they were feeling, how being able to express it. These studies clearly show that the emphasis on rationality is disproportionate, and much more attention needs to be given to the emotional nature or the affective aspects of transformative learning. In other words, what is the impact of emotions and feelings on the process of transformation? What about the affective? To explore this question means that one needs to look through different lenses and attend to different dynamics in the learning process. The transformative learning theory literature suggests that there are three primary aspects of the affective dimension. Now, you might not agree with the names that they've given them, but these are the names that they go under: grief, soul, and authenticity. Grief, soul, and authenticity. Underpinning these three aspects and anchoring the theoretical conceptualization is Jungian psychodynamic theory, with its emphasis or emphases on self and the concept of individuation. Individuation, by the way, in Jungian psychology is the process by which the wholeness of an individual is established through integration of the consciousness and the collective unconsciousness, in case you wanted to know some Jungian psychology, just in passing. In highlighting the necessity of individuation, Robert Boyd and Gordon Myers offer a different understanding of adult education and transformation or transformative learning than that of Mesereau. For them, transformation or transformative learning should be geared towards the expansion of consciousness and the working towards a meaningful, integrated life as evidenced in authentic relationship with self and others, or being in communion, if you like. Transformation is driven, says Boyd and Myers, by more than the rational and the reasonable. In their conceptualization of transformative learning, transformation occurs through a process of discernment and what they call grief work that is based in, as I've already mentioned, ideas of Jungian psychology. Concepts such as archetypes, shadow, persona, self are essential in understanding what Boyd and Myers call transformative education. For them, it's focused on contemplating and integrating the wholeness of life rather than on mere rationally discussing and reflecting on experience. Or simply put, the process of discernment for Boyd and Myers centers on how a person becomes aware of his or herself in the world. The increase of self-awareness is critical for them for transformation to occur. To be truly oneself, one must become aware of your view of the world and how this works. And they identify that this has to be an effective approach, that is one that works through one's emotion. So for Boyd and Myers, then, they suggest the terminology grief as the predominant condition for transformation. One might call it the bereavement process, if you prefer. Although our homiletics tutors may experience grief and be brought frequently to tears on hearing some of our sermons, I'm not here suggesting that grief-inducing preaching as a method of or for or in transformative learning be adopted. Although it needs to be acknowledged that the cross event could be interpreted as ultimate grief. Grief is a natural process and a reaction to change, especially when significant life events are involved. Grief can be seen as a normal and healthy process. Any change includes, at some level, a sense of loss. And as an aside, I think sometimes we don't fully engage with this aspect of transition. For instance, for our students, as some of you, many of them leave lives of high-powered businesses and so on. Things that they knew, the identity they had, they leave them behind to come here and train for ministry and doing, their first assignment and getting a 40 just. Grief, bereavement, is part of the... No, I'm not prophesying about any of your marks or anything like that. Grief is part of the change. When the world changes, grief is the appropriate, necessary, and often unwelcomed feeling. So for Boyd and Myers, what they're saying is, when disorientation strikes, there is a disruption. There is that sense of lostness that we should acknowledge, and they want to call this grief, and allow space and time to grieve that which you're letting go of in order to embrace something that might be new or different. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're letting go everything you knew, but what you knew or how you knew it may change. And they say the emotion that you go through in letting that go is grief. And for them, this side of the affective nature of engagement in learning needs to happen, or needs to be embraced, for transformative learning to happen. Sue Scott likewise argues that the process of grieving is integral to transformation. She says transformation is not a rational process. Her words. She argues, I think, too far the other way. But she argues that the affective dimension of transformative learning allows for the transformation to occur on a feeling level through images and symbols. And she says we can use these things to engage with the grieving process that helps to bring about transformation. As a six-year-old Claire said in a children's bereavement group, grief is complicated. And Edward Edinger, in his book on a psychological approach to the Psalms, puts it this way. Experience teaches us that psychological encounters with death, loss, grief, with sorrows of all kinds, when consciously met and dealt with, lead to a deepening, or can lead to a deepening and enlargement of personality, to a harvest rather than a loss. The tears of sorrow are, in fact, he says, psychological seeds which, when harvested, bring renewal and an increase of life on a new level. The second important aspect of affective dimension of transformative learning is the concept of soul. Or soul is the word that John Dirks, D-I-R-K-X, introduced to the table. He introduced that to the transformative learning lexicon. He's arguing that transformative learning involves much more than a technical and rational approach. He counters Mesereau's reliance on rationality by emphasizing that transformative learning also involves personal ways of knowing, and so makes use of imagination, symbols, and emotions, and he calls that soul. So for Dirks, soul is more than a psychological attribute, more than attending to feelings in learning. Soul has to do with authenticity, connection between heart and mind and emotion, the dark as well as the light. With this focus on soul, transformative learning in the affective dimension fosters self-knowledge through the use of symbols, imagination, and emotions. It is Dirks and Cranston's approach to transformative learning, in my view, that resonates more closely with what we do here, for instance, as tutors and as a college, what we're hoping that our ministers in training will be doing as we equip them to educate the church, to see, to engender, to facilitate change and transformation. Dirk, to give him his due, he acknowledges adult learning is chaotic. And I think it's good, it's a good word for it. But by grounding transformation in the soul, he removes the theory out of the head, so to speak, and into the heart. Speaking metaphorically, of course. The use of soul in transformative learning provides another facet through which one can view the transformative learning process. Well, I think we need to kind of bring this down to near Earth anyway. I'm not going to land today. We're just going to hover. Because if I carry on, I won't leave you any time for questioning, which might not be a bad... Anyway. The process of meaning-making is what Jung called individuation. Thus, Dirks' conceptualization of adult learning sees emotion, imagination as integral to this process. And sometimes in or perhaps overly rational approach to life and learning, we forget this affective side. Preaching needs to impact both the cognitive and the affective, the mind and the emotion. Of course, from a black Pentecostal preacher's perspective, this is seen as the norm, even if it is not so overtly articulated. They're always going especially for the affective, for the emotion, for the interaction, the engagement, the response, the immediate affective. Dirks and others, however, are going much deeper than that with their views on the affective. The emotional context of our experiences, in other words, need to be embraced. It is through our emotions that we sift through and make meaning of these experiences. Emotions are critical to the process of meaning making. A person's understanding of him or herself is fundamentally grounded in an emotional understanding of the self. And for Dirks, then, emotionally charged experiences are to be approached, not avoided. They are not to be denied as being inappropriate. Making meaning is more than a rational, ego-based experience. It involves the emotional, spiritual, and transpersonal elements of knowing. Dirks goes on to say, and I quote, "Emotions always refer to the self, providing us with a means of developing self-knowledge. They are integral to how we interpret and make sense of day-to-day events in our lives." This is indeed what he calls soul work, the soul work of the affective dimension of transformative learning. And I think preaching fits within that description of learning. And finally then, the third aspect of this dimension of transformative learning is authenticity. A somewhat elusive concept in adult education. Patricia Cranton locates authenticity. She puts it in the Jungian school again of psychodynamic. And for her, authenticity is grounded in the process of becoming conscious, acquiring self-knowledge, and working towards being who you truly are, being the person that you were made to be. She suggests that the process of becoming conscious, becoming aware of self and the world, is a central tenet of transformative learning theory. But she wants to highlight, and so do I, just because it's Jungian or has Jungian leanings doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong or should be thrown out. In other words, baby and bath water comes to mind just then. Crantle holds that gaining self-knowledge leads to transformative learning. Transformative learning depends on increasing our knowledge base, the process by which we become differentiated from others. It requires questioning one's own cherished cultural certainties and dearly held convictions, and it requires us engaging with the emotions. Individuation, she reinterprets to mean letting go of earlier identifications and perhaps being open to exploring what is unknown and sometimes often distasteful. To a great extent, we do that here with our students, our MITs. But this doesn't always seem to translate when they go out there on a Sunday morning. It causes me to wonder, about the doctrinal, theological, biblical education happening sometimes in our churches. Seeing preaching as transformative learning, I suggest, begins to more closely bridge this perceived gap between discombobulating, discomforting, challenging, and then equipping. I like to use the phrase, showing you where the bodies are buried, giving you the tools, and say, go dig. I was talking to someone earlier today who she was sharing with me, and he says I have permission to share this, that he was sharing he was reflecting on his own preaching. And I was rejoicing, actually, when he said this. He was sharing on reflecting on his own preaching over the years. And yes, he has preached on the hard questions and all of these kind of things. But it suddenly dawned on him that he was still more or less feeding them. So he decided to do a series on discipleship. And as the series on discipleship began, he had in front there a big bowl of breakfast cereal. And he had a teaspoon, various sizes of spoon, including a big ladle. And the congregation was down there. And he started off by saying, many of the things that I'm going to say, you are not going to like. And some of you will probably want to walk away from this when I finish this series on discipleship. And he said, and he demonstrated by using the spoon, and the longest spoon he had, and he picked it up, and he said, come and eat. Or eat. And he says, no matter how many times I try this, you can't feed from the longest spoon I have over there where you are. If you're wanting to feed from this bowl of cereal, you're going to have to get up and move. You're going to have to work. You're going to have to come forward and participate. Pick the spoon up and begin to eat. And so his preaching then began to take on a different form to say to folks, in order for you to grow and develop into who God has called you to be, it isn't sufficient for me to stand here and just, as it were, feed you or try to feed you with the spoon. You will never grow. Preaching ought to lead to transformation. But too often, I think, we hold on to I'm going to get myself in trouble now, the power, the positionality of it. So rather than empower the people to go and feed themselves and develop and learn and be transformed, we want them to come back to us because we have everything. Now, please don't mishear me. I don't want us to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but I think, and I'd like to suggest, that an approach to preaching that is linked with some of the concepts of transformative learning that we've touched on today will make better disciples. In fact, will turn us into disciples rather than either, baby making machines, new birth, and they come and they've got new babies, or whatever is at the other end of it. We begin to generate people who are able to dig and feed and also feed others. So if transformative learning is this kind of tool that empowers the folks, and this is the question with which I am finishing, how then should we preach? What should our preaching now be or look like? Thank you.